Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath. And today we get to speak with Dr. Lawrence Rubin, or as those at psychotherapy.net call him, Larry Rubin. You know Larry. If you know anything about psychotherapy.net, you know Larry. This was a treat for me to get to do some research in advance of this episode because most of what I had come to know of Larry was him interviewing others. And, you know, some of his written content on psychotherapy.net as well. But if you've read any of the written content, you have seen Larry's fingerprints all over it. He's interviewed some of the best and brightest over a period of a number of years now with psychotherapy.net. But today I get to speak with him about his role as a therapist, and in particular, a subject that's of interest to me, superheroes, the role, and let's call it the complex role of superheroes in our culture and also in therapy with young people, but also with adults. So this is an episode I'm very much looking forward to. Larry, it's good to see your face, brother. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Travis. I bet you say that to all the folks. Nice to be with you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. And I can see your cat you've got there with you. Tell the people about your cat. They can't see him, but maybe they can feel the cat's presence.
This particular cat is one of a sib ship of two. Her name is Jessie Pinkman. She was named after one of the main characters in Breaking Bad. Her sister is Georgie McFly. George was a little slow on the uptake early on, so reminiscent to that scene where Biff would knock on George McFly's head and say, "McFly, McFly," we named her Georgie, which I guess is my way of saying that I'm pretty much everything popular culture. Anything that is in the popular domain, whether it's comics or movies or television shows, I'm always looking for the stories. It's always about the people behind the characters. And I guess that's why I have historically been interested in and attracted to superheroes.
And before you introduce yourself a little more to folks, tell us about your office setup. I mean, I can see it, but can you paint a picture with your words? It's a really unique office.
You know, I guess it's a combination of thrift shop chic and mid-century modern, and then a little bit of touch of my own work with glass. I started out doing some mosaic stuff. I was in a Dunkin' Donuts. I guess this will give your audience more insight than they probably need. I was in a Dunkin' Donuts and I had a great picture of a Dunkin' Donuts mug. And I tried to coerce and browbeat the manager into selling me the picture. She wouldn't. So I said, the hell with this. I'll just make one out of glass. So I made that out of glass. And then I made a 1939 World's Fair scene and the Star Trek NCC 1701 behind me. There's a huge cherry wood 19th century secretary behind me that I guess I like history. I like history that you can touch. I like stories behind objects, and I have a 1958 futuristic television running in the background showing the first men on the moon. And just like I like to keep my blood circulating, I like to keep the electricity flowing through that old baby. So it's just a bizarre, eclectic combination of everything that I've ever found to be bizarre and eclectic. And I guess that's how I would describe myself. Not bizarre so much. Iconoclastic, idiosyncratic, eclectic, bordering on the ridiculous when I can get away with it. If you've seen some of the blogs I've written for psychotherapy.net, there are some interesting topics. I've been lucky enough to have a career where I've been free to pursue what interests me. And the crossover of popular culture and the arts and literature and history, I guess that's an intersection where I live.
That was a beautiful introduction to you as a human being, which I appreciated because I've enjoyed beginning to get to know you over the last couple of years. And usually you're the one that is helping to tell the story of others. And today I hope we get to dive a little bit more into your story and what interests you. Before we get into your therapeutic work, how did you find your way to psychotherapy.net? I think that's where a lot of people come in contact with you today. How did you get this gig where you've been interviewing and writing and telling the stories of others, as well as, blogging about anything that strikes your fancy?
Oh, my origin story. And you said I cannot swear, so I won't. Um, it's when I was promoted from visiting professor to assistant professor. I remember at my luncheon, the chair of the department said that we welcome Larry into the ranks of academia, into which he was breech born. And that's pretty much it. Ass first into the profession and ass first into psychotherapy.net. I was sitting in my office at St. Thomas University, where I retired after 32 years. And I had purchased psychotherapy.net DVDs over the years, and I was familiar with it. So my next door neighbor at school came in and said, "Hey, Larry, there's a really cool looking job. I think it'd be perfect for you," because she knows I write and I do therapy and all that kind of stuff. So I looked up the ad. Victor Yalom had posted the ad. And so I sent all my materials. And being incredibly impatient, the next day I called to make sure that he got the materials. And I did not know a Victor Yalom existed. I only knew that an Irvin Yalom existed. So when I called the next day to follow up on my application, this voice comes on the phone and says, "Hi, I'm Victor Yalom." And all I heard was Yalom. It's like, oh my God, Yalom. So I said, "Oh my gosh, it's an honor and a privilege to meet you. I've read your books and I use them in all of my courses." And I said, and he goes, "Well, thank you, but that's my father." And I actually remember saying, "Well, I guess I effed up this interview, didn't I? Thanks anyway." And he goes, No, hold on, wait. And after a 5-6 year probation with the company, because Victor's pretty tough, I solidified my place. So my origin story is sort of a metaphor for how I entered all serious aspects of my life, ass first.
Oh, man. I couldn't have asked for a better start to this particular episode. All right, now let's get into talking some about superheroes and also popular culture. I came across a book that you wrote, oh gosh, it must be 15, 16 years ago now, that sort of had to do with everything popular culture as it relates to therapy. So that's of interest to me too. But let's start with superheroes. So can you bring me back, talk about origin stories? I'm imagining that your interest in superheroes started long before you were a therapist. And I'm wondering if you can talk some about your early connection to superheroes and why they've proven to be important to you over the years.
Maybe like every other child in the 50s and now 90s, teens, 2020s, I consumed popular media as a kid. And as a kid, you had 7 television channels. And one of those channels in New York was Channel 11, I believe, The Adventures of Superman with George Reeve. And I loved the stories, the idea that you could fly, you could punch down walls, you can save the heroine. I liked comic books. I wasn't a rabid superhero kid, but those early seeds were planted about stories of these people who could do incredible things. And, I also used to fantasize about doing incredible things like getting X-ray glasses and doing things with X-ray glasses that a curious prepubescent 11-year-old boy would think of. But this was the 60s, so I won't go into detail. I lived on the 6th floor of an apartment house, and I never did anything ridiculously dangerous, but I used to like going onto the roof and enjoy the heights, the physicality of it. I in my prime, I could run fast. So I liked, I was a shy, nerdy kid from Brooklyn. And it's not like I laid in bed at night thinking of which superhero I would be, but there was always a place of interest in me about being able to be bigger than I was, faster than I was, more powerful than I was, maybe more socially adept. And even though I was main target of the third grade Larry's blonde hair fan club. I was otherwise a very socially awkward kid. So I think there was probably some, I don't know what the analysts would call it, projective identification, maybe, or projection, or identification with these fantastic figures. And then it sort of went dormant, then, adulthood hit and graduate school and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I amassed a major collection of comic books, but I did, when my son was younger, take him to thrift shops and flea markets and all kinds of other places where you could get cool stuff for free, very little. And he was drawn to the superhero miniatures, the action figures. So I started populating my office with action figures of the superheroes. Again, I didn't know all their stories. I never really claimed to be encyclopedic when it came to superhero stories. But slowly I noticed that some of the kids in my office, play therapists by training, would gravitate to the superhero figures. So that was sort of the professional origin, followed by the childhood origin. And then I wrote an article for a state play therapy magazine, then elevated to a peer-reviewed journal article about superheroes for the International Journal of Play Therapy. And then being sort of grandiose and superheroic under my clothes, I figured, hell, if I could get an article published in a professional journal, let's go for a book. And then came the workshops and the presentations and more familiarity with superheroes. And as I became more familiar with some of the stories, not all of them, don't quiz me on these damn stories, Travis. I just looked for opportunities to incorporate the superhero figures and the superhero stories into my clinical work. So it's humble, personal beginnings, and then a professional interest that evolved, got bigger than me. And from there, I just met some incredible people, both, professional and personal and clients, where superheroes was sort of the nexus for all that was important between us.
Okay, I want to hear more about how this made sort of the transition into your clinical and scholarly work. Because, being a psychologist and being around mental health professionals, I would say that sometimes as a group, we're not always the most creative or open to certain ideas. And I could imagine that perhaps the notion of bringing superheroes into therapeutic work could have been met with some resistance. Maybe not, you tell me, but I'm interested in that transition when you started really using those in your clinical work and it becoming a point of scholarly inquiry for you.
Probably the two came together at the same time. Not too long after the first couple of kids found interest in using the superhero action figures, that's when I wrote the article for the state's newsletter. And I've always been hungry to create, to produce. And I remember that it's interesting. It all sort of came together. I collected paint by number art. And my office was just festooned with vintage paint by number artwork. And some of the clients made comments about some of those paint by number art pieces. Oh, my grandmother had that hanging in her house. My uncle had this. And stories would flow from associations my clients would make to these paint by numbers. So I started a paint by number newsletter. From there, I realized I can write. I'm pretty comfortable writing. That's where I started enjoying professional writing, probably like mid-90s. I had a paint by number newsletter, but from there, as I gained more confidence in writing about popular culture things, I guess the soil was tilled for those times when there would be opportunities to write about some of the experiences of some of my clients as they related to superheroes. So I don't know if that answers the question. I was also in a very, even though I worked, I retired from St. Thomas University, Archdiocesan School in Miami. They were very permissive. They really let me do whatever What's Larry writing about? He's writing about psychotropic merchandise. Okay, good. What's Larry writing about? He's writing about paint by numbers and spirituality. Good, good. My resume started to build with things that I was interested in. And I guess for me, that I was very fortunate that I worked in a place that tolerated my idiosyncratic interests. A lot of psychologists get locked into university teaching positions, also into clinical practices where creativity and spontaneity are discouraged. Mm-hmm. And they are encouraged to pursue the evidence-based treatment protocols du jour. And I was not discouraged. I worked in a private practice. And for that reason, I had a lot of degrees of freedom in what I did clinically. So that same freedom of curiosity and creativity, spontaneity, and self-entertainment followed me from clinic to the classroom and back again. So I don't know if that answers the question. I'll try not to be as long-winded.
No, it definitely starts getting at it. I'll lean in a little more.
Okay.
When I was reading some of the work from various written materials and books over the years, you had this idea, and you know me well enough in my interest in narrative ideas that this probably won't surprise you that it tickled my ear as I was encountering it. But it was this idea of helping children uncover their secret identities. Mm. And this was really fascinating to me. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about how over the years you've helped to guide a young person towards discovering those secret identities and how the sort of metaphor of superheroes might be useful in that.
I like your use of the term metaphor. I think the superhero in therapy as a therapeutic vehicle is a deeply rich metaphor. Robust, as we might call it. It stretches in so many ways. There are so many elements of superhero stories. I can think of this one kid that I worked with. There was a video game, action figures about an alien entity that had powers. It was called Nanavar. I didn't know much about it, but this one particular child that I worked with was different from others, not easily accepted by others because his interests were so idiosyncratic. And there were certain elements there were certain things about him that other kids didn't warm up to. And what's fascinating was that his mom nurtured his difference. Was he neurodiverse? I don't know if he was neurodiverse, but he was diverse. But because of the diversity of interest, gravitated toward monsters and aliens and weird insects. The stranger the creature, the more he embraced it, and the more his mother embraced it with him and reinforced his uniqueness. She too is very unique. And I think she understood him in a way that nobody else did. And for that reason, I encouraged him and his mom to push the school to develop a club around monsters and villains and strange and unique characters with unusual powers. So I guess what I was helping him to do in a narrative parlance was to build a counter story. While the world might have seen him as this oddity, we were able to embrace what was, I guess, in David Epstein's, using David Epstein's term, a wonderfulness inquiry. It was a lived wonderfulness exploration with this kid. And I was more attracted to and felt that alter identity of someone who was creative and spontaneous and not afraid to be odd and different. That became hallmarks of the work with him. And that's what comes to mind with regard to helping a particular child embrace and alter identity, because the alter identities are the ones that we ask, which ones are the real alter identities? The faces that the heroes and superheroes show the world, or the ones that we conceal deeply inside? And what's our job as therapists? To help someone embrace the trueness and wonderfulness of their self, or to strengthen that altered identity that never gets fully expressed, or maybe just bringing the two together, helping the kid, helping the teen, helping the adult to merge all aspects of themselves into one powerful entity.
That's beautiful, and I love the example. It really brings the ideas. It makes them bloom in a way that I think just talking about this philosophically or intellectually couldn't. Okay, there was another chapter that was interesting to me. So you talked about the Incredible Hulk and like emotional literacy, and that was fascinating to me. And I'm wondering how you've used characters like the Hulk with clients, to help them articulate and maybe regulate strong emotions, anger, shame, overwhelm.
Mm.
Or, maybe there are other ways. Maybe it's not about regulating emotions. Maybe it's about doing something else. But that's kind of the language that gets used in our field, right? But you were clearly using the Hulk here in a particular way to help a young person navigate distress.
The thing about these movies, the superhero movies, superheroine movies, super entity movies, is over the years they become so, with the use of all the magic of the cinema, computer generated images and all that stuff that can only, the way that they bring some of these stories alive through the special effects is just amazing. And of course, when the Hulk is all about power and restraint, that battle of expression and repression, and we don't know if it's the expression of aggression that hurts him or the repression of anger and frustration that represses him. But the Hulk is this wonderful example of the battle between expression and repression. It's a simple binary, but if you think of all the research and writing that's been done about regulation and dysregulation, the Hulk is just a platform for the expression of the conflict that kids have with themselves, within their families, within societies, between expressing what is real and true, regardless of its intensity and destructive power, and controlling that for the purpose of fitting in. I remember a girl that I worked with who was struggling with her mom. Her mom, for reasons of her own, was very unhappy in her life. She had been recently divorced, and her husband was not particularly supportive. She was repressed emotionally. What she wanted to do was stand on a rooftop and rage against the world for the injustices that had been committed against her. Yeah, her husband treated her brutally, not physically, but in ways that don't leave external scars. And her relationship with her daughter was the stage on which she was acting out this conflict between expression and repression. And she came across to the daughter as domineering and controlling and minimizing. And the daughter was so much smaller than her. And even though she was 13, she had no power. She identified with the Hulk. I didn't have any She-Hulk characters in my office, but she identified with the Hulk. We used the sand tray to work through some scenes of emotional awareness and expression. She was not comfortable with the expression of anger because her mom was very handy at slapping down all those attempts. Part of our therapeutic work, which may sound bizarre to some, understandable to others, was she would place the Hulk on a chair in my office and shoot it with Nerf guns. And that was it. And it wasn't about, it was about not suppressing anger. It was about developing a relationship with anger, developing a more of a comfort with the expression of anger. And through that, we worked on ways for her to express herself genuinely to the mom, who was in therapy at that time. So she was more receptive to hearing some of her child's discontents. I remember one of the first sessions with this girl, she was sitting on my couch and I had a wall of miniatures in my office, wall to wall, ceiling to floor. And that she sat there with a Nerf gun, pointed at my wall of miniatures. And she said, "What would you do if I was to start shooting at some of these things?" And all I'm thinking was, shit, it'll take an hour to put all this stuff back. So I try to channel my best Carl Rogers, Virginia Axe line, and said, "It sounds like you're wondering what I'll do if blah, blah, blah." I gave her permission. Thankfully, she didn't tear my wall apart, but she became more comfortable, I think partly through her relationship with the Hulk, sort of an externalization of anger, what society regards as anger. And that led the way to, I think, inroads into the relationship with her and her mother. And the Hulk is just one example of some of the stories that have become popularized, but I'm always looking for I was always looking for the backstory of the heroes, the clay feet of the heroes. I wrote an article for the Journal of Popular Culture about superheroes in psychotherapy. So I've always found them fascinating characters. Are there other? Yeah, there are characters of history and nonfiction. There are characters of politics and religion who are heroic. But superheroes always resonated with me. I have a Superman tattoo on my arm. There's some, I mean, that's the magical connection to my own childhood. So for that reason, they voted. I'm rambling on.
So here's something I'm wondering about in this present moment in history. It's an interesting one. I don't know that. I mean, I think sometimes we think that the moments that we live are just so unique, and some of that's just, I guess, the bias of being human. But indulging that for a minute, it is an interesting time that we currently live in, especially in the United States, and it's an interesting political time, et cetera.
Well, that's a euphemism if I ever heard one. Yeah, interesting times.
Yes, thank you. Horrific in some ways,
Thank you.
and interesting in others. But I wonder, when you think about superheroes in modern culture, like right now, are you aware of any particular ways that superheroes might be doing work now that maybe was a little different than the work they were doing 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago? Or is this just kind of ubiquitous from generation to generation that superheroes are doing the same kind of work?
You know, I'd like to say that I am current on all superhero movies, but I am not. I think my interest and use of superheroes peaked about 7, 8 years ago, and life's too short, too many projects to follow all the movies. I think about the history of superheroes in our society. I remember the comic books during World War II where superheroes would fight Hitler, and during the 60s, the superheroes would take on the makers of the atom bombs and the alien invasions as we explored space. If I was enough of a student of superheroes today in the movies, I would probably fall on the side of ubiquity and timelessness, that the plots of the superhero movies are keenly tied into the politics of our society. I know that they are tied into gender politics and racial politics, religious politics, if you can use those two terms in the same sentence. So while I don't have a keen familiarity with the stories of the last 10, 12 years, my guess is that it's the same thing since the inception of the superheroes, of heroes into mythology and antiquity, that they are created to take on, to create a stage on which to act out, maybe resolve, attempt to offer solutions to some of the crises happening today. And I'm sure there are superhero tropes and themes that perfectly mirror what's happening in our government, what's currently happening in our society, forces of oppression that are going on between cultures. But that conversation is for someone who's a little more attuned to some of the newer movies. But I would guess that they continue to address the contemporary crises and challenges as they always have. I think that's why we use them. That's why we've created them, to be orators, to be actors and actresses, for the themes that are important, that can't be said directly by the politicians, by the spiritual leaders, by the economists, and the ones that do get beaten down anyway. So I think superheroes have a strength that prevents them from being subdued around some of these more contemporary issues.
How do you help young people, but also adults? We're going to get into adults and your work with adults in a minute, but how do you help people differentiate between maybe something like empowerment and storying through fantasy versus avoidance through fantasy? Because this is something that comes up a lot. I hear people go, oh, well, the kids are just these days, it's like the kids are diving into video games or whatever it is, and that's avoidance. I mean, in a different generation, they were diving into comic books, and they're just avoiding the world by being in comic books. You could go back in the late 1800s. There were people that were concerned about kids reading books, and books were horror and fiction story. So how do you help differentiate between maybe like empowerment and storying through fantasy and avoidance through fantasy?
I don't know that I'm not comfortable with the terms avoidance versus empowerment. I think, there are two types of people in the world: people who think that there are two types of people in the world and people who don't. I just finished a play therapy course here at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and we had a clinician who you'll become familiar with. Her name is Jessica Stone, who has done just groundbreaking work on the use of digital play therapy and virtual reality and all things digital in therapy, play therapy. And she did a presentation in Minnesota. At the end of the presentation, my friend who was attending, who was a rather conservative chap and had to be convinced that digital play therapy and the use of virtual reality and online role-playing games and all these other things that you're sort of alluding to, was convinced that that was just escapism. That was just encouraging, avoidance through fantasy, avoidance through social media, avoidance of real interactions, by immersion in virtual worlds. At the end of her presentation, my friend, John Seymour, said, who specialized in ethics in play therapy. We wrote an article together on that. He said, it would be unethical to not consider a child's interest in online role-playing games, to not integrate their use of anime and manga and social media into therapy, because that's their world. The idea that there are digital natives and there are digital immigrants. I think it's the same thing when it comes to superheroes. I think if for a particular child, a superhero character resonates with them, they identify with the journey of Superman from his home planet, or what happens to Spider-Man. If a child identifies with, or a child finds connection with others through an online role-playing game, then I think we do them a disservice when we wonder, is this avoidance or is it something else? I think the question itself leads to an unproductive argument, and ultimately the child becomes marginalized, and the child's interest in and use of superheroes and fantasy figures becomes sidelined, and we have basically disempowered them in the process. So, for some kids, is it avoidance? Is that pathology? Or is it that's their more comfortable realm? That's their lingua franca. That's the way they express and connect. Who are we to say it's avoidance? That's just us oppressing them. And I know you are no stranger to issues around depression. And so in a sense, helping kids connect through whatever fantasy figure they find empowering is itself a form of empowerment. So I hope that answers it.
I really appreciate that answer. And Jessica Stone, we've actually had her on the podcast. She was episode 12 on August 6th. So for folks interested in what Larry was just referencing, I'd highly encourage you to listen to that episode. And we'll also have her on a webinar early next year with psychotherapy.net. Okay, Larry, I want to talk some about this work with adults. Specifically, I know Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is something that you've used with adults, and maybe you've used other sort of superhero or superhero adjacent ideas with adults. Can you talk about some of this work you do with those who are not children or adolescents?
I was doing a presentation in the Midwest when my first superhero book came out. I was popular. I had my 15 minutes, and it lasted for at least 20 or 25. But whenever I would do a workshop, and these things were attended by 50, 60, 100 people just dying to know how to use superheroes in therapy with kids and teens and adults. And there was always one person in the audience who I found my way to, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of superheroes. I don't. I never professed to, but there was always that one person in the audience. On a break from this particular workshop, there was a biker in the back of the room, big, burly biker, tattoos everywhere, with just the kind of person, well, just a big biker. And he came up to me and he said, "This is really great stuff. I really appreciate it." And he went on to contribute in the latter half of the workshop all of his knowledge about superheroes. And then I asked him a simple question. I said, "How do you use superheroes in therapy?" He said, "I don't." And I found that absolutely amazing, because he was, maybe he was afraid to come out of the shadows and reveal something so deeply personal and important to himself. But I took a cue from him that if this is a guy who his alter identity is about superheroes, then what might other adults be bringing onto the clinical stage that might be useful? I was always attracted to the stories about heroes. Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, and the way that I'm sure there are other mythologists, but he's the one I'm most familiar with. But he identified the series of steps that the so-called hero takes on their way to heroism. It's that last scene in the Disney movie Hercules, where he says screw, and he dives into the river Hades to save Meg. And I'm sure there's some equivalent to that in antiquity. But I've always found the stories of transformation fascinating. And what's therapy? Therapy is about some sort of transformation. I was working with a gentleman who was struggling with anxiety, and it really manifested in the workplace. He was unassertive. He was more knowledgeable and skilled than any one of his coworkers, and he was always passed over for raises. He was always passed over for advancements. The anxiety had such a hold on him. If I would have known much about narrative therapy back then, it would have been some wonderful externalizing conversations. But he was really being victimized by anxiety. And I remember in that moment, and I never asked people, "What are your interests in superheroes?" Although I would suggest incorporating them into clinical interviews. But I remember this one scene from The Terminator, where John Connor comes back. John comes back to meet Sarah. And he says basically, "Hey, lady, you got to save humanity." And they're in a tunnel. They're in some sort of water tunnel. And she refuses. She says, "It ain't me, babe. No, it ain't me. I'm not the one you're looking for. I'm not the savior of humanity." And that corresponds to Campbell's refusal of the call to heroism. So I asked him if he'd seen the movie. And he said, yes. And we talked about that scene in the sewer pipe and what it meant for him to refuse the call, to really step up and engage with his skills, to really stand up and say, hey, I know this shit. I know it better than, excuse my language, I know this better than anybody. I have a right to be, but I'm having trouble crossing over the threshold in my life. And that's what that transition for Campbell was, is how to get out of that liminal space and accept the challenge and embrace your skills, come what may. So we role played different scenarios of how he would find his way to express his power and his voice at work. He got fired the next day. No, just kidding. It worked out well for him, but I had some sense that that particular metaphor of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey would land with him. And I don't think you have to go to ancient mythology to look for some of these challenges that people have day to day. But I think when working with him in particular, we put his challenge into a historical context. We made him part of a larger movement of empowerment. So that comes to mind about how I used it. There was another situation where I was working with a family, the identified patient, if you will, for those systems folks, was this kid on the spectrum, neurodiverse. His brother was hell on wheels in his own right, but the mom and the dad just had more kids than they could handle. These two kids really, weighed in at about 8 or 9 kids on the scale of parental challenges. And I, for the first time in my career, I used the sand tray for an intake. I had never done that before, but I trusted my instincts, and we spent 3 sessions building this magnificent sand tray of the problem that was in visiting the family. The little boy, the primary character, was the volcano in the middle that they were trying to contain. The father depicted himself as an astronaut, head down in the sand, but his alter ego was Superman, because there was something absolutely impotent and powerless that he felt as a parent, but he knew he had other skills and gifts because he was competent in the world. It was just at home with his kids that he felt like a failure. So we had conversations between the astronaut and Superman. And Superman's goal was how to help right this astronaut in the sand, how to set him back on his feet so he could embrace his power. That was one of the few, those two come to mind. And in answer to your question, because the stories that were part of those hero and superhero journeys are just part of broader stories that we all share. We all have transitions. We all refuse certain challenges. We all recede into this liminal space. We all meet demons. We all have guardians and sidekicks. And adults appreciate that. So there have been times when I've used the mythology theme and some of the elements of it to help adults sort of broaden their awareness and help them feel part of a larger historical flow rather than isolated with their pathology. I am rambling. This is the coffee, Travis. I promise. This is the coffee.
I didn't experience it as very rambly, Larry, but I could go 8 different directions with what you just said. I'll just choose one.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that there's so much that was generative in the work you were just describing with adults, and yet it seems that so often superheroes, even mythology and certain kind of stories, get storied themselves as kid things, kid stuff, immature, and then people miss out on the potential of what you just described.
Yeah.
What's your sense of how we can help adults understand that there might be utility and value in maintaining relationships with superheroes and mythology?
I think it goes deeper than that. I think a question that makes more sense to me, Travis, is how do we help adults connect with their childhood?
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say something. Ask the question again, because I distracted myself. It's one of my super failings.
No, it's no problem at all. I'm just wondering about how we might help adults come to appreciate superheroes, mythology, things that often get storied as kid stuff.
I think by helping them to see that their own challenges, their own journeys, whether it's a challenge in their relationship, whether it's a challenge at work, whether it's a challenge in identity building, that these are timeless tales, that the struggles that they have are struggles that so many others have had for thousands of generations, and that while they emanate in childhood, they continue throughout life. We continue to search for connection. We continue to search for meaning. We continue to search for a God that makes sense to us. I think we continue to search, we continue to seek validation, whether it's on the golf course, in the kitchen, at work, with our kids. So I think it's taking any particular challenge that an adult might bring to us and couch it in a broader context of a heroic struggle, and maybe ask them to connect with some experience they had in childhood, their own childhood, when they had to stand up against a villain, where they had to step outside of popular circles, where they had to look inside, look into the mirror, where they had to be a wizard in their own life to transform an obstacle into a possibility. I think adulthood can kill. Adulthood can kill grown-ups, and I think that if the therapist is alive fully and still connected to the values and virtues of childhood and some of those core obstacles that kids have to overcome, and then helping the adult to say, yeah, I'm still having that same damn dream at night. What's with that? Or I still end up with the same kind of person in relationship. I end up at the same dead end at work. I'm still struggling to feel important. I think if we can give them a richer narrative of their life that spans all the way back to their childhood, I think we can help them feel more whole, rather than they're just experiencing some shitty situation with their boss or some terrible moment in their relationship with a spouse or a child. I have a friend whose daughter is going through a divorce, and her kid is on the verge of getting expelled from school. I sent her a passage from the interview that I just did with Kay Ingemels about the wonderfulness interview, about, I guess the Eagles is going through my mind, how oftentimes it happens, we live our lives in chains, never knowing that we even have the key. And I think the short answer to a long, helping adults to remember what it was like to be a kid, and helping them to continue challenging themselves and recognizing that these seemingly insurmountable obstacles are not. And sometimes the superhero stories, or a hero story, Nelson Mandela or Lech Walesa, or any of these characters. Deepak Chopra wrote a book, The Seven Spiritual Secrets of Superheroes, with his son. I think that can be incredibly important too with adults. It's helping them to connect their spirituality to the history of their life and the history of their people. Okay, next question. Oh, I want to share something. I have to say, I wasn't sanctioned by this. You would find as a moniker of pride, but I was interviewed by Craig Melvin for MSNBC on superhero therapy, and I never called this superhero therapy. So when I got home and I watched the replay of it, across the bottom of the screen, the chyron that was being shown at the bottom of the screen while I was being interviewed was the American Psychological Association does not endorse superhero psychotherapy. You know, that was such an adult slapdown. And it reminds me also that I wrote a pretty popular textbook with a friend, Alan Schwitzer of Old Dominion. We created 30 clinical cases from popular culture characters. It's a great book, had a great time writing it, got sciatica from writing the damn thing, but we submitted it. I don't know why we submitted it to the American Psychological Association. And they love the treatment planning. They love the diagnostic portion of the book. And they said, but these stories, where the hell did you get these stories? Who cares about Christopher Robin? Who cares about Naruto? Who cares about Kal-El? Who cares? They didn't say it that way, but they're basically saying these characters that you've used for your case studies, they're not real. And I think that's another answer to your question. When we stop believing in fantasy, when we stop allowing ourselves to think beyond limits that are imposed on us, like adulthood. And I'm not saying that quit your job and go, get a motorcycle and, travel the country. But I think another answer to your question is some adults have forgotten how to be playful. And maybe even asking them what heroes and superheroes, who did they emulate? It may be their father, it may be their grandmother. So that's all I have to say about that.
So many gems in there. One of my favorites, adulthood kills adults. Ugh, that is an amazingly succinct and tragically poetic way of describing what I see happening around us frequently. I was actually going to go in the direction of, the APA and so forth, and you brought up this great story that you just shared. And I'll ask this in a more general sense as we're moving towards the end of our time together, which is the very beginning of our interview. You shared that you're a bit idiosyncratic. You kind of explore and have taken up writing about things that speak to your heart and who you are, even if they wouldn't be traditionally thought of as intellectual or academic. And fortunately for you, you're at a place where you could do this. But I have a feeling with the next generation of therapists coming up, which I know there are a decent number of those therapists that listen to this show and therapists in training because they've written me and they're listening and they're hearing you talk about doing all of this sort of irreverent practice with superheroes and so forth. And there you are on, what was it, MSNBC or whatever, being interviewed about the work that you do. And, the APA does not endorse this, which, by the way, what a badge of honor, man. Congratulations.
So.
But these young people that might be listening to this and wondering like, gosh, how, even if it's not superheroes, it's more in general the way that you pursued your passion and what may have been, on the margins of therapy practice. What advice would you give these young people to find, their calling in this field, even if it doesn't match, what you're quote unquote supposed to be doing?
Yeah. I don't think I was subversive for the sake of subversion. I was a rebel with a cause, and the cause was myself. The cause was what interests me, what excites me, what challenges me. I'm looking around my office here. Some of this stuff I've got I have a replica of a wooden mailbox from the 1950s. I have a Hoosier, handmade by a guy in 1913. I have our Mother of Guadalupe, made out of resistors and transistors. I got such, and it was the same thing in my practice. Again, not everybody who's listening to this is going to have as many degrees of freedom as I did. But maybe the degrees of freedom didn't choose me. I chose them. I intuitively knew the paths that were okay enough for me to travel down where I could still maintain fidelity to myself. So when I was building my playroom, and this is an answer, I promise I'm getting to the answer. My playroom was just a cacophony of crazy shit. Anything that I thought could be useful in play therapy. whether it was a bolt that held up, an electrical pole, or wires that opened up into 17 different colored wires inside of them, or my office was so non-neutral. The analysts would probably have strokes if they came into my office, but I didn't invite people. Just like people seek out therapists like Mary Jo Barrett, who specialize in working with incest in adult relationship, or people seek out Jessica Stone because of her fascination with the digital world. People sought me out because there was something different about me. And it wasn't on my business card, hey, look how different I am. But because I came to increasingly value myself and the differences between me and mainstream. And great, I got a PhD. I'm a full professor. I'm a diplomat. I got all those bells and whistles. My advice with all that said is, and it's the advice I give to my interns. I'm an instructor for 2 internship sections in the master's program at Nova Southeastern. I say to them, you have brought gifts and abilities. You have brought values and virtues, to use narrative terms. You have brought curiosity. You have brought yourself into this profession. Don't let, as Mark Twain said, don't let your schooling get in the way of your education. Don't let your professional pursuits get in the way of continuing to evolve as a person. And if the people listening to this are wondering, where does all this fit in? Well, it may not fit in for you. You may be sort of petrified, maybe by your own doing, maybe by circumstances of oppression, academia including. Be true to yourself. If there are things that interest you, then they will be of interest to your clients. That's been the way that, I don't impose myself on my clients, but that's always been the way with me. Whatever interests me, whatever gets my blood flowing, whatever gets my circuitry buzzing, I'll usually find some way to connect with clients around it, because I'm looking for things that fascinate them. I'm looking for issues and challenges and achievements and failures that have formed the stories of their lives. So my message to my interns has always been, whoever you were before you got into the graduate program, try to remember that and continue that path. Don't just stop that path as you now become a professional counselor, where you stroke your chin and you say, a lot, and you pray to the gods of evidence-based approaches, which have their places, but sometimes they don't. To thine own self be true, I guess.
To thine own self be true. If people are looking to read more about some of what you've been talking about today, is there any particular place you might direct them, any particular books, articles that you hold close to your heart?
I was up for a job at Nova Southeastern University, and these folks, there were serious bow ties in that room. And someone looked at me and said, why exactly did you include your work in the Journal of Polymorphous Perversity on your resume? And I said, it's some of the best satire I've ever written. And in order to write good satire, you really need to know your field. Tell me the question again.
Well, now I want to know, the original question was if there's any bits of work,
Okay.
but now I want to know about, I want to read what you were just talking, what was the Journal of Polymorphous what?
Perversity. Travis, you would love this stuff. I sent you a few of the articles when you just started. I'll send you a few again. Read some of my blog. Of course, I have my books, Medical Play Therapy and Child Life, and Superheroes in Counseling, and Psychotropic Drugs and Popular Culture. I have all that serious stuff, that bifurcation between pop culture and psychology. But read my blogs on Psychology Today. I wrote dozens of blogs, and you'll see the humor and the seriousness, the playfulness, the creativity, the subversiveness. Read some of my blogs on psychotherapy.net, which you may have heard of a few times on this podcast. Yeah, sure. Read the serious stuff that I've written, but you'll see also that within every serious thing that I've written, there's light. What did Leonard Cohen said? Everything's broken so the light can get in. Yeah. So read the blogs on Psychology Today, psychotherapy.net, and and read some of the other stuff. Ultimately, what draws them all together, they're about people. Whether it's the woman in front of me at CVS ordering, having a meltdown because they don't have her Xanax for her dog, or me driving past the toilet seat mounted to a telephone pole, that's one of the blogs I wrote about also. I look for meaning where meaning might not seemingly exist to people who are looking for meaning to be ponderous and always deeply meaningful. I look for meaning in everything. And ultimately, the relationships with my clients, with my students, with my reading audience out there, all 7 of them, it's about connection. I've always been about connecting. So that's why some of the reading. I'll send you some of the articles I wrote for the Journal of Polymorphous Perversity. Great stuff. The journal itself was great. And it's not about sexuality.
I can't wait to read it. You're one of a kind, Larry. And if they're Googling you, Dr. Lawrence Rubin, but we call you Larry here. So glad we've got you on. We didn't really even get into pop culture. So I mean, there was a little bit of that here and there, but I think we're going to have to do a second episode here down the track. So I appreciate this, let's call it introductory episode, Larry, and maybe you and I can get together here in the coming months for a part 2.
Absolutely, Travis. And thanks for these podcasts. I know you look for interesting people, and I think, like me, you are interested in being interested.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I absolutely am. You're talking about things that get your blood circulating. That's what does it for me. People's stories and the idiosyncratic nature of their stories, finding the little oddities about what they're saying. I'll have to listen to this one again because there were a number of them. And actually, I could just look at my notes. But boy, the one that will stick with me is Adulthood Kills Adults. That's tragically brilliant. So I appreciate you bringing your heart, your soul, everything that you did today for us, Larry. Thank you, and I'll look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Well, I'd rather be tragically brilliant than brilliantly tragic, Travis. I'll talk to you soon.
Mic drop.
Mic drop. Obama. Goodbye.